Brilliant. Many thanks, Robert and Charlie. Some really interesting points. And we're getting a lot of questions coming in, which is fantastic. And I'd just like to say that we probably won't have a chance to answer all of them live, but Robert and Charlie have offered to answer them later. And when we send out the recording, you'll get answers to the ones we didn't get to answer live. And we also had a number of questions that came in while we were, actually, can I just share the screen, Charlie? Can you, Robert, sorry, stop, yeah. So we had a number of questions that came in while we were through the registration process. So I'm just going to ask one of those first, while the other people might be wanting to add a few questions to the Q&A now. So this one that came in earlier is quite a general one, but it's like, what should society seek to achieve? So resilient places or resilient people? Any responses to that? Oh, it's Robert, you're on mute still. Sorry.
Apologies. I think that goes back to the point about the importance of resilience being sort of, socially constructed essentially, and that it's key to, we shouldn't be imposing a resilience on society. We should be inquiring what society wants and then trying to implement that. So I think that's the way I would answer that question. So I don't think a priori we know that. That's something in this process you would investigate. And I think in that investigation there would probably be learning on all sides as well. So that understanding of resilience may well evolve with time.
Anything you'd like to add to that, Charlie?
I was going to say very, very similar, that it can be both. It can be either or both. Those things.
Yeah. And there is a lot of interest in the questions about the concept of resilience, and so there's quite a few questions that relate to that. So there's one that's been getting a lot of interest is about there might be a difference between resilience with respect to trends over time and resilience in relation to extreme events. So do you have any views on whether approaches to managing the two things would be different?
I think that my answer would be that really we need to try and come through with a framework that's addressing both. I'd say that in the end, extreme events are probably how we actually experience most of the adverse effects of flooding and erosion. So any kind of resilience framework for flood and erosion hazard has to be taking account of the extreme events. And then when we talk about sort of the trends that are happening over time, they will generally be exacerbating or reducing the consequences of extreme events. So that's how they're manifest. So I think you need it needs to be joined up. I wouldn't see that you'd have a resilience for sort of mean change and a resilience for extreme events. I think it has to be one sort of one systemic view.
Anything to add, Charlie?
Yeah, I think it is important to recognise that there are some places in the UK where they do have these kind of long-term trends, especially of erosion. But I don't necessarily think the framework needs to be that different in order to address that, as opposed to an event-driven. If you think about it, even these long trends tend to be stochastic events that happen, regularly over time. So you can still break it down into that kind of framework if you want to.
So there's another question here again about the sort of the framing of resilience. So there is this framing of resilience, I think you referred to it, Robert, sort of the socio-ecological, that sort of thinks about not just bouncing back into the same place, but bouncing into a new, more resilient place. So based on the ecological rather than the engineering concept. So what is your review that resilience is not only bouncing back into the same place, but bouncing forward into a new, more resilient place in terms of coastal resilience?
Well, I think that the fact that we can the point here, that the fact that we can sort of measure resilience means then that we can actually, within the coastal resilience model, you can actually start to explore different scenarios of the future. So I think that's one of the key points, that we would really be able to start to look at sort of, if you like, virtual events. That's obviously, and then actually make policy choices about different directions we wanted to go in. And so therefore, this question about, do you want to return to where you were, or do you actually want to go to somewhere slightly different? You know, I think that again, that's a kind of question. I think in general, is our coast in an optimum state? I think often it's not. And there are clearly, for example, one of the reports we were referencing was the Climate Change Committee report, which identified that maybe there's hundreds of kilometres of coastline where we have defences today, and probably under current project appraisal guidance, those areas cannot be protected. I mean, those areas defences cannot be justified. So these are the kinds of places where change needs to happen, and this provides a framework maybe for sort of thinking through how you might deal with that change. So I think the coast will evolve, and with this you can start to maybe actively help it to evolve in ways that you think are evidence informed.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, and there's also an element of bouncing back differently as well. So it's not just bouncing back to the same or bouncing back to something enhanced, but also, you know, bouncing somewhere else. And all of those kind of concepts, I think, can be investigated within this method because of the flexibility you've got there of engaging with the stakeholders and seeing what it is that they want, but also in terms of investigating the different potential outcomes of different interventions.
Okay. As part of this discussion about resilience, there's a question here about, it's flipped. The capacity to adapt. So that's something quite different to physical monitoring. So how do we measure and monitor that capacity to adapt in organisations, I guess, and in communities and individuals, maybe even?
We didn't explicitly include that within the current resilience, within the current coastal resilience model. We were not explicitly including that as a metric. But then I think this is an evolving process. I think if people felt that was a really critical parameter to understand resilience, then you'd have to extend the model. So I mean, this is demonstrating a process here. We're not saying that the way we've approached it is the objective way of producing resilience. There are other ways. So that kind of thing could be added in, but it's not actually an explicit part of what I presented here, because we were going for the art of the possible as well, I suppose. I mean, in terms of, but as we move forward, I think, and we learn about what we want to measure, then new data sets can, as Charlie was saying, we can start to acquire new, maybe an additional data sets. In terms of but back to that point, the capacity to respond. I mean, I don't know. I think surrogates. I think the budget you're putting into different types. Sometimes budgets may be a good surrogate measure for your capacity to adapt. Others could say it's not adequate enough, and then you could think, well, that's a debate. Then we could say, well, what else would you think is important, and we can have a discussion about that. But but I'm just saying straight away, if you want to go to something quick and dirty, maybe the budget available is a reasonable first indicator.
Or you've also got metrics like the deprivation index as well, which gives some indication of kind of the economic ability to bounce back in a community.
Right, okay, thanks. And there's a kind of, in addition to the discussion about bouncing back here, is Kevin Burgess. He says he likes the diagram that you presented, the bouncing back and maybe sort of bouncing.
The link-off diagram.
Yeah, the link-off. Yeah. However, in the rest of the presentation, I'm seeing a definition of resilience measures and results, but not clearly how the ability to bounce back is actually being measured or quantified?
Well, I think we're using indicators of I suppose of the system state, really. We're linking that through to kind of existing government policies. This is something again that could be discussed as the method developed, but it's not trying. It's not really. It's not a system dynamics model, I suppose. It's almost that implies that we're actually we're looking at indicators of the system state and how they evolve with time. So that's how we're considering it.
Okay. So there's a long question here. So it starts with a statement. So the new DEFRA flood and coastal erosion risk management policy statement talks about transforming the current approach to local flood and coastal erosion risk planning so that every area of England will have a more strategic and comprehensive local flood and coastal erosion plan that drives long-term local action investment, linked with wider plans for an area such as water resource plans and local nature recovery strategies. Do you think this framework presented in the research could form the basis for this different approach and expanded to cover all sources of flooding?
Yes, I think that what the kind of way we've presented today could provide significant, could inform that process very well and provide, I think, new evidence and thinking about what that vision implies a much more integrated sort of view of these issues. So I think, and what we're doing is bringing together different lines of evidence. So yes, I think that it could be very useful in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Has the loss of or damage to the historic environment been factored into your analysis at all?
We did not explicitly include heritage assets as a parameter, so we're not measuring that. So in the current coastal resilience model, that is not included. Again, I mean, as I say, it's flexible. That these things could be added if people felt that they were important. So that's it's something that that could be added.
Okay. So there's another question here that's I think really interesting, and it came certainly out of the conference that you mentioned that happened a couple of last week or the week before. So and it's just gone disappeared. Yes. So the issue we always face with trying to find preferred ways forward is in balancing sort of trade-offs, so balancing objectives which often conflict. And the same will surely exist with the various resilience measures. So how do we address the conflicting aspirations? Otherwise, are we not simply changing the parameters but left with the same challenges?
That's a good question. And we haven't got to the stage of thinking about that, because really we're trying to come up with an approach where we could quantify resilience and how it would evolve, how it was in space and how it was in time. But absolutely, when you start to look at the real world, trade-offs will exist. I think that this method would provide a new lens on those trade-offs. That's the way I would sort of turn it round, that you'd actually be able to look at the resilience measures under different possible futures, and then you could actually, and so that analysis then would probably inform the trade-offs that you make. But sure, at the end of the day, we can live in one world. In a model, we can have many worlds in the future, and we can think about them, but we've got to pick one of them we're going to live in.
Yeah, and the different stakeholder perspectives as well lets you, I think, investigate some of those trade-offs as well, because presumably that a lot of that will come out of the different stakeholder groups and what their priorities are as well. So one thing that it can do is actually give you a forum for discussion, because you can present the different views and the different resilience scores that come from the different perspectives, and that can create a place to start those kind of discussions.
Yeah.
And I think Charlie's that's a very good point that Charlie's made, that I think one of the important things about this is actually the discussion around this. So I think it's the learning that takes place within the project team as we develop these methods. There was a lot of learning within the project team, and I think that process would continue. And as I suppose when you think about the SMPs, we had SMP1, and there was quite a lot of learning about SMP1, and then we had an SMP2. Now we have SMP. Now we have the SMP refresh. So I think these types of exercises are processes, not endpoints.
Mm-hmm. Great. I've got one more question, and I think we've run out of time. So can you comment on the resilience index, the hexagonal units? Is it not a vulnerability map showing the need for resilience rather than the presence of resilience?
Well, I think what we would say we were evaluating resilience. So if you have a low resilience score, you could turn that into a need for resilience. If your goal was to enhance resilience, you are identifying those areas that need more resilience enhancement. But I don't think it is a vulnerability map. No, I think it is our attempt to measure resilience. But I think in the policy implication would be, the areas with low resilience, and if that's of concern to you, then you would do something to enhance that. So you can see where you would prioritize resilience enhancement.
Great, many thanks. And I'm afraid we've run out of time, so that we have plenty more questions, and hopefully you'll get sort of written answers to them, and they will be sent out when we send out the recording. So it just remains me to say thank you very much to both our speakers. We have more webinars coming up. So the next webinar is on the 4th of November, and it's given by Don Monteith, who's from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and he'll be talking about forecasting the risk of environmental exacerbation of dissolved organic matter, so the problems caused by a rise in dissolved organic matter in upland drinking water, and the change in the risk due to a changing climate. And then 2 weeks later, we'll have Neil MacDonald from the University of Liverpool, and he'll be talking about his collaborative work on investigating approaches for bridging the qualitative and quantitative data gap in climate and hydrological sciences. So please sign up for these webinars. The recordings will be sent out, and the slides from today's webinar to participants, and a link will be made available on our website over the next few days. So it just remains me to say thank you very much again to from the Champion team here at Leeds, to Robert and Charlie for all your insights and a great discussion, and for everyone for attending. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.